G'day. So here we are for round 2 of where to start. Now in the previous video I talked about looking at the drawings, looking at the parts, identifying various features. Now we're going to try and put some of that stuff together, plus a few hints about, what to do. This nut, as you can see, it's got a stepped profile to it. Now one of the first things I'm going to do is actually bore that and put the thread in. And so there's the block I'm going to take that out of, and I'm not actually going to step that until I've done the hole and the bore, because it makes it easier to hold on to. So before starting machining proper, you need to think about how you're going to hold on to things, and maybe not do all the prep that you otherwise would do, just do some of it. So in this case I've squared up my block. I'm happy with that. I've marked out where I'm going to be, but I'm not going to do that bit or that bit until I've done my main feature where I need that holding on power. Previous video I spoke about identifying your critical relationships, your primary datum features, and for a round part that's typically the bore or something on the periphery, the circumference. So for these it's pretty straightforward. That's the bit that is everything is going to be linked to, and so therefore I'm going to start with that. I then put my mandrel in, and that becomes my primary datum. My gear teeth are being cut from that. I might have faced this off as part of my prep, but if I need to, I can trim that back to that bore if I need to. So that's where your primary datum comes in. That's one of the first things you're going to want to do normally, because once you've got that, you can then space things off from that. On a flat part, on a milled part like this, it's a little bit more difficult sometimes identifying what the important things are, but in terms of this I would say, well, I'm going to call that a datum. Okay, everything I do is going to be from that. I'm going to start by putting those holes in, because they're the key part. I may leave that in a vise or clamp to a table, or I may decide to hold that down with some screws, but from that I can then say, right, I've got a primary datum there, I've got some hole centers which I can use to address everything else. I'm set. I've got a starting point. Everything else I can fill in around that. One of the things I like to do, particularly with sheet metal, is I like to indicate where my datum is. If I'm going to make up a U-shaped bracket, for instance, out of this part, or this piece of metal, which is just a scrap from the scrap box, I've gone through and I've got my square, and I've determined that's the squarest corner. Okay, you might have an odd-shaped piece of metal, which doesn't matter because you're going to trim it away, but that's my square corner. So all the measurements I make to position holes, I'm going to take from that edge and that edge. Okay, and that establishes my coordinate system, but that way I'm being consistent. I've got a square edge, I'm measuring from that. We're establishing features from that same datum. Okay, I do it a lot in sheet metal. When I'm doing things like that, I don't worry about it quite so much, because sooner or later you get a feature in there which is, no, this is this end, that's that end. One of the things when you're planning out your operations is that you would avoid putting in features which would then cause interrupted cuts for other features. So in this particular part here, there's a hole that goes through here that I'm boring through, and so that's going to be interrupted, and that'll cause chatter. That could potentially break a tip if I'm not careful. So in this particular case, I drill that out. I put the cotter in there, restrain it so that it doesn't rotate in the cut. I then do that feature, and that gets me that scallop on there, as well as not having an interrupted cut. So sometimes you need to think about putting in some scrap material so that you can consume it and not give yourself problems. The same applies to sheet metal, but for different reasons. Typically in a home workshop, getting a bend in a precise position is difficult. And so if you've got a hole that needs to go in after a bend, you're better off putting the bend in and then measuring from that bend to get that hole in the right position. Sometimes you can fluke it. Sometimes if you're doing a lot of repetitive work and you've got stops set up, you can get that hole spot on. But in general, if there's a critical hole that has to go there, that's got a relationship to your datum, which is on a sheet metal part is typically one of your larger flat surfaces, then you're better off coming along later, measuring that and putting the hole in. Another thing, while I've got this sheet metal piece here, I mean it's only a demonstration piece, I'm not quite sure whether it can be seen. This hole here is about a diameter away from the bend line, and you might just be able to see there's a little bit of distortion there. So that's another good reason why you need to think about, do I put the holes in first or do I put the bends in first? By putting the hole in first and then putting the bend in, you can distort that, and if you've got enough holes or enough relief and it's close enough to your bend line, you'll actually distort your bend. So in cases like this, bend first, holes later. The other thing you need to do is support what you're doing so it doesn't deflect. And so this is a machinist vise, it's one of a pair. I got one like it in a box of miscellaneous and decided I liked the style so much I made another one. I've got to do it again soon, so I'll probably do something on that. But if you've got something long and thin in a vise, then put a jack under it and clamp down on top of it. I actually have two machining vices, so that for long thin parts I can have one sitting there on my table, the other one will slide on the table of the mill, but I can then grab a long thin part and hold that. Another thing is using centres, so put a centre in a shaft to help support it. When doing long thin things, and this applies to milling and turning, the other thing is there's a rule of 3 times the diameter. So basically, if that's 16 millimeters, you go back 48 millimeters, and you can machine that unsupported without too many ill effects. As soon as you start getting more than that, you start getting more deflection and more chatter, all that sort of stuff. So you need to think about that, supporting that, whether that be with a centre, with a steady, if you're on a mill with a machinist jack or another vise, something along those lines to try and avoid deflection and chatter. The 3 times rule also applies to cutters. Typically when using a milling cutter, you probably don't want to go more than, if you're cutting a slot, more than about half the diameter of the cutter. Of course means if you have a small cutter, it means you can't go as deep, and so the best idea is to try and use the biggest diameter cutter you can get in there. I mean, if you've got a small slot or a feature where basically a large cutter just won't fit, you can't, but try and use the biggest cutter you can, just so you don't get that cutter deflection. A lot to think about there, but hopefully from these 2 videos you've picked up that there's a need first to look at the part, work out what the important features are, and plan your operations around that. Once you get to machining the part, you need to think about support for those things, how are you going to hold it. I always try and start by putting the primary features in first, the primary datums, and then working out from that. If it's a choice between doing something high risk and low risk, I generally try to opt for the high risk first, because it means that if you're making a part with a lot of work in it, if you muck up the high risk bit, at least you haven't wasted all the simple stuff that's gone in. Sometimes you've got to do the simple stuff because you need to hold the part, or you need to you won't have access, or you need to do something and use those low risk things, hold whatever to position, but yeah, if it's a toss-up, go for the high risk stuff first. So I guess to recap, analyse your part, pick out what your primary datums are, what the important features are, start with them, work your way out. While you're doing that, think about holding things, how you're going to hold it, how you're going to manipulate it. Beginner machinists, particularly on mills, always think about vices. Vices are one thing, but you might have to make up a jig or a fixture. You're better off making those beforehand, because there's nothing worse than getting something set up and then realising, oh, I need to make up a bracket to hold that, and then having to break everything down, make your bracket, and then do it all again.
So I hope that helps people understand a little bit more about where to start on parts and what they should be looking for when they're trying to machine things, and how to approach jobs. It's not an easy thing to do, and it's one of those things that experience is a great teacher, but hopefully you don't have to make lots and lots of mistakes getting there. Anyway, thank you to those watching, and thank you to those who've helped me and inspired me along the way, and we'll catch you next time.